All right, everybody, welcome back to the Red Raider Report. And Don and Adam, we're at the, midway point, I guess would be a good thing to say. Non-conference plays came to an end. Now we're at that segment where some of the teams are finishing up their non-conference schedules this week, but Tech's off, and then we get into Big 12 play. And, Don, I guess I'll ask you straight up. I asked you this last week, and I guess I'm now more of a believer that Texas Tech, you look at they're number 9 in the coaches poll, number 10 in the AP. The teams above them, below them, they're probably ranked where they need to be right now.
Probably so. We talked a little bit about it last week. I think there are some other teams nationally that that you might, right, if you like them, put above Tech. But this has worked out close to as well as it could have for the Red Raiders. Because a big thing I think is you want to kind of follow the pattern that Kansas set last year, which is as long as you stay undefeated, you're going to stay up there. It's not really going to it doesn't really matter all the time the quality of the opponents that you face in non-conference, because once you get into Big 12 play, the opponents that you face are going to be legit. You're going to have plenty of chances to face other teams that are in the top 25. And so as long as you keep winning football games, you're going to put yourself in position to actually go play football in January. Right.
And Adam, I think maybe you're at the stage where you're not exactly ready to drink the Red Raider Kool-Aid at the national level. You think there's maybe some teams that just need as much consideration as Texas Tech is at that spot?
Well, I say that I haven't been been convinced or that Tech hasn't done anything yet, but I think they're probably about where they need to be. They do have the athletes. I think they have the ability and the potential. They've just got to show that a little more once they get into conference play.
Right.
And I think, right now it's tough to say, well, this team should be a couple spots higher, or this one should be a couple spots lower. Because so many teams, especially the upper echelon teams, have been playing against much lesser competition. Right. So I really don't know that, even 4 weeks into the season, I'm not sure how much we know about everybody. I think it's going to take some challenge, you look at games like some of the SEC games that have already been played, in the ACC with Wake Forest, Florida State, even the USC Ohio State game. Those games kind of give you an idea, tell you where those teams stand, tell you how good they are, or maybe they've been overhyped a little bit. I think with Texas Tech and a lot of those teams kind of around them in the polls, we really don't know yet. So I think Tech should be happy with where they're at, because as Don said, if they keep winning, they can only go up.
Right, and Don, we're at that point in the season where we can start to talk about where we kind of think these teams in the Big 12 are going to stack up at. What do you see so far as surprises, or maybe some teams that have underachieved a little bit in the Big 12?
Let's see. Actually, I don't know that there's there's not really a whole bunch of teams that really jump out at me as surprises. Oklahoma State, I think, has shown some pretty good things. They, of course, are still undefeated so far. And the thing about them is they have some young talent on offense that's been real productive so far, both in the receiving game with Des Bryant kind of busting out and doing what folks expecting of him coming out of high school. He was a super talent, and he had a good first year to kind of get his feet on the ground, and now looks like he is going to be kind of an all-conference type wide receiver. And then on the other side, you have running back Kendall Hunter's been really productive for them so far, in addition to some of the other backs that they have. Missouri, of course, has been going great guns offensively. That's not necessarily a surprise. That's kind of what you expected with Chase Daniel and Jeremy Macklin and some of the other weapons that they have. I'm a little bit concerned from their standpoint. If you're a Missouri fan, defensively, they've given up some points, and you look at, statistically, they're dead last in the conference in pass defense, giving up about 280 yards a game. They've given up 8 touchdowns through the air, I believe. That's something that they kind of need to address. I'm surprised maybe a little bit at how much Texas A&M has struggled, even though kind of expected it. It's still a little bit, you don't expect to see that team lose to Arkansas State, and then, of course, wound up giving up 40 to Miami, and I don't think Miami's that great a football team either, and you're not used to seeing that in Kyle Field. Of course, maybe from a surprise standpoint, just the fact that Baylor is still sitting at 500 right now, and now it looks like they kind of have their quarterback of the future, and have already had one of their biggest wins that they've had in a few years with the victory over Washington State, and kind of have maybe at least a little bit of good feeling going for them.
Right, and Adam, I'm going to start with you on this, but you look at early on, you guys were both riding the Oklahoma-Missouri train, for the Big 12 championship game. I mean, is that where you're still setting, or do you think maybe there could be some change in that sector?
Oh, there definitely could be changes. I think right now it would be silly not to say that it's, there'll probably be Oklahoma and Missouri in the Big 12 championship game, but a lot can happen. I mean, we talked about Baylor, losing to Connecticut. I mean, people say, oh, okay, well, they couldn't beat Connecticut. Connecticut might be a pretty darn good team this year.
And Big East co-champion last year.
Yeah, that's right.
They have one of the best running backs in college football right now.
Right. I mean, to me, even though they lost, that's an impressive. I mean, that's a pretty impressive performance. I think Baylor could shock some people. I'm not saying they're going to win the conference, but I think they'll be competitive, even with some of the better teams. You look at the South Division. Oklahoma certainly looks the strongest right now, but I think Texas or Texas Tech could knock them off. I'm not convinced with Oklahoma State. I think they're good enough offensively, but they're not going to be able to stop the other teams from scoring enough. I think you're looking at, Texas, Oklahoma, and Texas Tech in the South. Oklahoma's got a slight edge, but the other two aren't very far off. And I think Colorado is gaining ground on Missouri. I'm not so sure if Kansas is the second best team in that division right now. I think you've got to put them in the mix. But I've been pretty impressed with what Colorado's done so far. They've got two young running backs who are very good. They seem to have a little mojo going. Who knows? I mean, if they keep winning, and we could be talking about, Colorado and Missouri.
17-14 victory over West Virginia, and you got to like Colorado, I guess, because they have been tested at least by other teams who are in Division 1A and other teams who are in major conferences, as opposed to the teams like UMass and some of those that the Red Raiders have faced.
Yeah, and that's what you got to respect about Colorado. They have the intestinal fortitude to go out there and play these schools, and then they beat them. I mean, okay, if Colorado loses by a touchdown or two to West Virginia, you say, well, not very good, but not real bad. You beat West Virginia in overtime on national TV. That's a huge boost for the program.
Right, and after Florida State's, I'll just basically say a pretty horrible offensive performance against Wake Forest last week, you kind of got to give an edge to Colorado. That game's not in, Tallahassee. It's in Jacksonville. You got to look at the Buffaloes. They're probably going to win that football game, and that's a lot of momentum, guys, heading into Big 12 play.
If they do, I think it'll be tough. I look for Florida State to play better this week than they did last week. I'm not so sure. I think it'll be a close game. Either way, if Colorado can either lose a close game in Florida or win, then you're right. I mean, they're steamrolling into conference play.
Right, and Don, the question that I'll have for you is, much as if in the SEC that we're going to see, these teams are going to beat each other up. They're going to knock each other out of national title races. They're going to knock each other out of BCS bowl slots. Are we going to see that inside Big 12 play as well when these big dogs from the South and the North start having to play each other in direct matchups?
It could happen, obviously. Big 12 South has always been a dogfight. In the last few years, Big 12 North has been down, but they're kind of, I think, cycling back into prominence. And you look at it, and they've had some head coaching changeover, but now you have, Colorado with Dan Hawkins in his third year, Kansas State with Ron Prince in his third year. Of course, Mangino had his best year ever at Kansas last year. And so, Iowa State with Chiswick in his second year, they're still trying to kind of take steps forward. But some of the programs in the Big 12 North are starting to cycle back. And but I do think that in a conference like the Big 12, generally the way it's worked out is you've had a team that you've had a couple of teams that have been either trying to go for undefeated seasons or one-loss seasons, and generally when you've had that happen in the Big 12, you've had BCS accommodate two Big 12 teams.
Right, and you look at last week's results, Adam, and we've already talked about UConn and Baylor and Colorado's big win over West Virginia, but Kansas State on Wednesday night, due to the Ryder Cup, they played at Louisville, and we maybe learned a little bit more about the Wildcats after that game.
Yeah, it wasn't a great performance. Josh Freeman made some mistakes. I think they turned the ball over 3 times. Obviously, 38 points is way too many to give up to a team like Louisville, I think. I don't know. Kansas State, to me, is going to be one of those teams where, one Saturday, they're going to look like one of the best teams in the country. The next Saturday, they're going to look average. I really think they're going to be that type of team. They're going to get a couple upset wins, they're not going to be very good otherwise.
Right. And Don, we talked a little bit about, Missouri maybe looking a little bit human in the game against Buffalo. That game was tight early on before Missouri finally got their offensive rolling. That game ends up 42-21, but they showed that there's maybe some weaknesses there, and like you've pointed out, you can move the ball through the air on the Missouri Tigers.
Well, yeah, and I'm not sure exactly why, because Missouri, to me, should be a good football team on defense. They have a bunch of players returning in their front seven, and had William Moore, big safety back, who is pretty much a preseason All-America candidate.
Right.
Sean Witherspoon,
Sean
Witherspoon, Player of the Week, Defensive Player of the Week.
Sean Witherspoon at linebacker, I believe, leading the conference in tackles right now. So I think, playmaking defensive end like Striker, Shulock. I think the personnel is there on defense, and maybe they're, maybe they're a little bit a victim of their offense is so fantastic that their defense isn't really having to play on the edge and being forced to get stops right now. But I said a week or two ago, be careful of making too much of one game here, one game there. When people were comparing how Tech did against Nevada to how Missouri did against Nevada, folks were saying, "Oh, Missouri clearly better than Tech." But then again, Missouri struggles for a long time to put away Buffalo.
Right, and if you want to get down that road, you can go and say, well, they gave up a ton of yardage, and Illinois looked great in them against that opening game, and then Illinois has looked really bad. Since that game, they struggled against one of the Louisiana directional schools.
Now, with that said, though, it sounds like I'm dogging on Missouri. I still think they're, to me, clearly the class of the Big 12 North, and I wouldn't back off of a prediction saying Missouri should still win should still win that division.
They're hard to slow down. They're really hard to slow down, especially with Jeremy Maclin.
At the same time, we're just saying that they're not perfect. There are some chinks in the armor there. And I think, as the course of the season plays out, all it takes is one lackluster Saturday on the field. All it takes is a couple bad plays here and there. Teams that want to win the conference championship, that want to have a chance to play for the national title, there's really no margin for error in today's game.
Not this year, because USC's not going to lose. Their schedule is not exactly going to be tough. I mean, you're going to have to come out of conference play unscathed, and in the Big 12 and the SEC, I think that's a pretty tall order this year.
It is. On the bright side for those teams, obviously we've seen in the SEC where a one or even a two-loss team can make it to the national championship game because that conference is so tough and so stacked. I think the Big 12 is kind of getting there, but not quite at that level.
Right. And you look at the rest of the schedule last week, and we had a pretty intriguing into the night. With we talked about Miami taking care of Texas A&M, and Texas, though, Adam, they beat Rice 52-10, and I think the thing you got to take out of that game is their secondary has grown up in a hurry, and they held a very good quarterback from Rice in check for most of that football game.
Texas is starting to round into form. In fact, I think they've really been a little bit better than I thought they'd be. Colt McCoy is playing out of his mind again. He's having a great year so far. No one really impressive in the running game, but they haven't had to be. And the defense, I think, has been good. I mean, you look at every one of Texas's games so far, it's been a blowout. It's been a pretty easy win. I think what might hurt them, we'll see how this game, moving Saturday they're playing Arkansas. And they were supposed to be 2 weeks ago. They were supposed to have a bye going into the meat of their schedule. We'll see how that plays out because the Arkansas game is probably going to be, definitely tougher than an open day would have been. We'll see how that affects the Horns. It's something we may not know for a few weeks down the road.
I think it may affect their Big 12 play, but not the game itself, because I don't know, but Arkansas, Don, especially, they have not looked impressive under Bobby Petrino early on.
Which is what I was going to say. Even after this Saturday, I'm still not sure how much you can take from that game, just because Arkansas has not been a very good football team so far, and obviously with the weapons that they've lost. Longhorns, I think lucky for them, they don't have to be tackling Felix Jones this coming weekend. Felix Jones or Darren McFadden. Now Felix Jones looks like he should have been the top 5 overall pick.
Right. You look at the last 2 games of the night, Don. KU beats Sam Houston State 38-14, and then poor Iowa State, they lose a heartbreaker in overtime to UNLV 34-31. They almost broke that road losing streak.
Yeah, and that would have been a good victory if they could have gotten it, because UNLV had beaten a Pac-10 team. Now it's escaping my memory which team it was out of the Pac-10. But so UNLV, not a bad football team. I think a pretty good go for Iowa State to go on the road and take them to overtime.
Right, and Adam, you look at this week, Texas Tech's off, obviously, and the rest of the Big 12 schools are kind of finishing up their non-conference slates. You look at the games there on the list, and you talk about, Army and A&M, Colorado at Florida State, which we've talked about, Arkansas, Texas, which we just spoke about, Louisiana Lafayette at Kansas State to finish up their schedule. TCU, a surprising TCU, number 24th ranked team in the country. They go to Norman. They'll get their toughest test of the year against the Sooners. And then we talk about Troy at Oklahoma State. That team's going to be looking for a little revenge after being flat out embarrassed in Alabama last year. And then the other great game, I think, Virginia Tech at Nebraska. I think you're going to learn a lot this week in terms of some of the Big 12 teams that we may still have a little bit of a verdict out on.
Right. I think the last three games you mentioned are really the ones I'm going to keep an eye on, especially the TCU at Oklahoma. I remember 2005 very vividly, first game of the season. In fact, I had a friend over who was staying for the weekend who was a huge OU fan. And he was just absolutely heartbroken that afternoon. TCU comes into Norman and beats the Sooners 17-10. I think OU remembers that. TCU is a good football team, and I'd love to see them hang with OU again. I just think OU is not going to let that happen again. I look for OU to win fairly handily in that one. I think it'll be close for a while, and OU will pull away at the end.
Sooners have gone a couple of weeks in a row where they've had nearly 600 yards total offense. They're looking great on both sides of the ball right now.
Yeah, they are. I think TCU's gonna play. Gonna give them more of a challenge, which is probably what the Sooners need going into Big 12 play. But yeah, I don't see how they're going to be stopped completely. Virginia Tech, Nebraska. I like that one, too. Nebraska gets his first loss of the year under Bo Pelini. Virginia Tech hasn't looked very good this year, but they're going to be better than Nebraska.
Right, Don, I think the game I look forward to the most is Troy and Oklahoma State. Mike Gundy and them remember that last year. They remember what happened.
That was what started that whole chain of events that ended with the I'm a man, I'm 40
exactly.
comments. Yeah,
because, Jenny Carlson from the Oklahoman actually observed, Reed's behavior after that game, and very warrantedly, may I add, I'm going to defend her, wrote that article because it proves that, she was pretty much right after you saw the way that season played out. But you're right, that game started off this chain of events, and this, I think, is the key component for Oklahoma State. They have to win that game in Stillwater and avoid a serious hiccup before Big 12.
Well, and that's the thing. I think they'll be very motivated to win that game in Stillwater. It's not just Troy. It's not just Troy coming to town.
Yeah.
It's the team that beat them 41-23 last year, and is a pretty good, if little-known program. Remember, Troy's a program that sent OCU, Manura, and DeMarcus Ware to the NFL, and again, hammered Oklahoma State pretty good last year. That was where the Cowboys started to make that transition from Bobby Reed to Zach Robinson, which I think outsiders probably were wondering what's going on here, because Bobby Reed was the guy who'd been the huge big-time recruit. Zach Robinson maybe not quite as well known, but clearly I think Mike Gundy knew what he was doing, because Zach Robinson's been a good quarterback from that football team pretty much from the word go since they stuck him in there.
Yeah, we've seen that, and we've seen that proven over the first few weeks of the season. And Larry Blakeney, you're right, has done a great job at Troy. You talk about Tony Franklin, their offensive coordinator last year. He is now with the Auburn Tigers, and their offensive a little bit of struggle against LSU. They lost a tough game there, but it just shows you the class. And they also had a top 10 pick this year in the NFL draft, with the linebacker, McClendon. Mm-hmm. So, again, that's a pretty strong program, so it'll be interesting to see where that game goes. But I think, Adam, you brought up the key point in saying, we're Texas Tech's opponent after this off week. They host the Nebraska Cornhuskers. We're going to find out a lot about where Bo Pelini stands against a Virginia Tech team with who very wisely has made a switch at quarterback. And that's going to be a really tough game for the Huskers, even though it's in Lincoln.
I agree. I think, like I said, I think Virginia Tech's going to find a way to win that game, and Bo Pelini is going to realize afterward that he's still got a lot of work to do. Nebraska really hasn't played anyone tough yet. It'll be interesting to see how they respond. This is going to be the closest game they played in, more than likely. Mm-hmm. Will they fold the tent and realize, hey, we got a long ways to go, or will they rally around? I think the former is going to happen.
It's probably an okay game for them to play. I also think that Virginia Tech will go there and win. But and I've been not a Nebraska believer at all this first month of the season. But they have, I think the key thing that they've been doing is they've been giving themselves some things to build on. Joe Gans getting settled in at quarterback and being pretty productive. Marlon Lucky kind of continuing, picking up where he left off last year. And so it's a team that's kind of, sounds funny to say, but I think important for the Cornhuskers to build a little bit of confidence early on. They've done that now before they kind of take another step up in competition.
All right, guys, that's going to wrap up this episode of the Red Raider Report. We want to thank our sponsors at Campus Design. Get down there at 98th and Quaker and check them out. And as always, these guys' stories all year on RedRaiders.com, a product of LubbockOnline.com, and our home, the Lubbock Avalanche-Journal. For Don and Adam, I'm Zach. We'll see you next week.